In this edition of 1+1, assassination, disaster and politics in Pakistan, we speak to Fatima Bhutto on the country's problems and its president. Hello, I'm Jane Hutchin. Welcome to the programme. The United Nations has called Pakistan's floods the greatest humanitarian crisis in recent history. At least 20 million people have been affected. That's more people than the Asian tsunami, the 2005 Pakistan earthquake and this year's earthquake in Haiti combined. Author Fatima Bhutto wastes no time in attacking Pakistan's president, who went to Europe while many of his people drowned. Ms. Bhutto has lost many family members to the assassin's bullets. The author of Songs, Blood and Sword is speaking with our Europe correspondent, Philip Williams.
Welcome to 1+1. Your book paints a really tragic picture of your country, corrupt, led by despots, murderers, utterly unable to administer the country properly or unwilling.
Yeah.
Do you see any future, any bright spots for your nation?
Oh, absolutely. I think when we talk about Pakistan, we have to differentiate between the states and the people. And we know, we have ample evidence that the state has failed, that this government is a failure.
Is it a failed state?
Well, but it is not a failed state. I think we can say that the mode of governing has been a failure. I think we can know that this government and the last government have both failed the Pakistani people. But as a country, absolutely not, because it is a young country. It's only 63 years old this year. It's a country that ought to be very rich. We have gas, we have oil, we have coal, we have natural resources. We have a people that are survivors above all else.
And of course, right now,
yes,
those human resources stretched to the absolute limit with the floods.
Absolutely.
One of the key questions that is constantly asked is, well, if the country is so corrupt,
yes,
is endemically corrupt, how can I, as an Australian, donate money and be sure it gets to the right place?
Well, I think that's a very important question. And when we look at the government and we know they are corrupt, and we know, for example, that money that was given after the earthquake to the government was mislaid. We know, according to Transparency International, that something like 70% of the World Bank's funds for flood prevention to Pakistan were mislaid. We know then that we cannot trust this government, but what you can trust, and assuredly so, are organisations like UNICEF, like Oxfam, like the Red Cross, like Merlin. All these organisations are transparent, they are accountable, and we know that they do phenomenal work, not just in disaster zones, but they have histories also of really coming through for Pakistan.
Why do you think there's been a relatively slow international reaction to this? We're talking about 20 million people affected, 4 million homeless. The figures are absolutely staggering.
And it's something like, as you said, 1 in 10 Pakistanis. We know that a fifth of the country has been affected, and millions of acres of land. But the reaction has been heartbreakingly slow. And I think it's owing to not only this government's really quite egregious reputation of corruption and political malfeasance, but also this impression that people have, if they give money to Pakistan, it will somehow end up in the hands of extremists, when in fact the opposite is true.
Now, of course, the president is your uncle, a man you distrust, dislike, and blame partly for the murder of your father. That's an incredibly serious charge to make of somebody in that position.
Yes. Well, it's not just me who makes that charge. Before Asif Zardari was chosen by his own parliament to become the president of the country, in the same way that the dictator General Musharraf was selected to be president, he was facing 4 murder charges involving the murders of 11 men. My father's case was just one of those. He was standing trial in corruption cases in the United Kingdom, in Switzerland, in Spain, and across the country. He is one of the most venal and certainly one of the most dangerous figures in our short history.
And yet here he is, your uncle, Your aunt, Benazir Bhutto, his wife, was assassinated.
Yes.
Your father was assassinated. You say that your uncle was assassinated, and your grandfather. It's a terrible family history that you chronicle in this book.
Yes, and unfortunately it's not unique to the Bhutto family. We know that Pakistan has a history of assassinations. It was very early on in our history, it was 2 years after our independence, that the nation's first appointed prime minister was murdered in Rawalpindi, and no investigation was ever carried out.
What makes this particular, your family different is that you're saying some of that murder, some of that mayhem is coming from within.
Yes.
That Benazir Bhutto was also partly responsible for your father's death.
It was during my aunt's last government that my father was killed, and he at the time was a member of parliament, and he was one of thousands of men to be killed in extrajudicial killings in the city of Karachi.
You say the police actually pulled the trigger?
Yes. We know that Benazir's government empowered the security forces, the police, the elite paramilitary sort of squads in Karachi to, quote, clean up the city under the aegis of Operation Cleanup. And in the year and a half that Operation Cleanup was in effect under Benazir's last government, some 3,000 men were murdered. They were journalists, they were political activists, they were dissidents of...
But we're talking about the Prime Minister's brother.
Yes. Well, we know that the policemen pulled the trigger, as you said. But what we also know is that after the killings had taken place, not just of my father, but 6 other men who accompanied him that night, it was my aunt's government that arrested all the witnesses to the murder, and they were placed in jail without access to lawyers, without access to their families, until her government fell, while all the policemen were honourably and internally cleared in a police review and put back on their beats. It was my aunt's government that stopped my family from filing a police report, a first information report, which is every citizen's right. We had to go to the courts of Pakistan to have our rights returned to us. And it was Benazir's government that stopped us also from filing a criminal case, instead putting a tribunal in place to investigate the murder, but a tribunal that had no legal authority to pass sentence. And it was that tribunal that ultimately concluded that the assassination of Murtaza Bhutto could only have happened with permission from the highest levels of government.
And then, in the next decade, she herself is assassinated.
And many things seemed to surface also in her murder. When my father was killed, the police cleaned up the scene of the crime immediately. And it was something I raised with my aunt at the time. Why were they allowed to clean the road of blood and glass? And she dismissed that. And we know then that 11 years later, in the case of her murder in Rawalpindi, the same thing happened.
Are you worried that in a sense, there's a Bhutto curse, that it could be generational, violence begets violence, and you're the next generation? Are you worried about your own personal safety?
Well, those are two, I think, separate questions. In terms of the curse, absolutely not. I think when we look at dynasty, we have to know that for Pakistan it has been disastrous for the country and for the family. It hasn't been democratic. It hasn't strengthened the institutions of the country. And it hasn't served this family. To believe there's a curse is also to believe that the Bhuttos never did anything wrong, to believe that their lives were without fault. And that's partly why Songs of Blood and Sword was so important to write, because I don't believe there is a curse, but I believe we can change the way we live, and we can change that cycle. In terms of my own safety, that this has become an issue since the book has come out. It has put not only me at risk in Pakistan, but also many of the people who spoke to me. And that is because it is a breaking of that silence.
Who do you think now has an interest in killing you?
Well, I didn't really take any prisoners in the book, I spoke very openly about the violence of the Pakistani army, of the Pakistani political establishment, but most pointedly of this current government.
Of course, one weapon that you have is political activism. When are we going to see the next generation of Bhutto perhaps Prime Minister, President?
Well, I hope he won't. I hope that this country of ours, this country of 180 million people, will be allowed to make other choices.
Do you rule that out totally, a political career? Absolutely, 100%?
It has to be. I think for Pakistan...
So much so that you can guarantee me the first interview when you become Prime Minister or President?
Well, we won't be having an interview then.
Then there's a guarantee you can easily make.
Yes, because I think if we perpetuate a cycle that at its core negates participation, then in fact we are hindering the democratic process in Pakistan. And Pakistan so desperately needs its democratic institutions strengthened. They are incredibly weak, if existent at all.
Your cousin Bilwal is likely to be a very important political figure in the future. Mm-hmm. Do you see the dynasty continuing through him?
Well, it's too early to say. It's too early to say, but I think most Pakistanis understand that Bhutto is a last name. It's 6 letters. What makes a man or a woman politically in Pakistan is their ideas and their principles and their platforms.
True, but history through that name has tremendous power, and you know that better than just about anyone.
And I think, unfortunately, we've seen that the name alone has hurt Pakistan more than it's helped it. We know that when you are asked to vote on names, on photographs, and on personalities as opposed to political ideology, we'll end up in the mess we are today.
Do you wish, on reflection, the Bhuttos had gone into, fishmongery or something like that?
That would have been interesting, actually. I do wish that they would have been allowed, certainly in the case of my father and his brother Shahnawaz, I do wish that they would have been allowed to make their own destinies.
Is there pressure on you from people within the People's Party for you to run, for you to adopt the family
yes.
heritage?
There has always been pressure. There has always been pressure, unfortunately, because I think there is a lot of affection for this family, and it's difficult, especially in a young country, to break away from a family that has dominated not just the country, but people's lives in such a mythological way.
Just going back to your book, when you read your book, it's very much, in a sense, a love story about your father, mm-hmm. a very, very important person, obviously, to you. Mm-hmm. And you must have felt his murder extremely deeply mm-hmm. at such a young age. You were just, 14? When he was taken away.
Well, the time that my father was killed, that kind of violence surrounded us in Karachi. We heard gunfire at school. When we opened up the newspaper every morning, there were body counts. It was an incredibly frightening time to grow up in Karachi, to grow up in Pakistan. And